Good evening. I'm Jeff Bennett.
And I'm Amna Nawaz. On the NewsHour tonight, mass firings begin at government health agencies, including people in key leadership positions.
As the window narrows to find survivors of the Myanmar quake, aid groups warn of the next threat, the overwhelming need for food, water, and health care.
And how a decades-old effort to provide cheap rice to Haiti has made it difficult for the nation to produce its own.
We can't ignore the more than 5 million Haitian people, so half of the country, that is facing high levels of acute food insecurity.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions, and friends of the NewsHour, including Kathy and Paul Anderson, and Camilla and George Smith.
Certified financial planner professionals are proud to support PBS NewsHour. CFP professionals are committed to acting in their clients' best interest. More information at letsmakeaplan.org.
The John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, fostering informed and engaged communities. More at kf.org.
I absolutely love my job because I love the people I work with. Everyone is trying to connect on a personal level.
We look out for one another. We love to see our teammates thrive.
You don't have to change how you walk. You don't have to change how you talk.
We can bring our authentic selves to work and do our best stuff. That's joy.
And with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to the NewsHour. The Trump administration began terminating thousands of staff and purging some of the top leaders today at the Department of Health and Human Services. That included several key agencies, including the FDA, the CDC, and the National Institutes of Health.
Hundreds of HHS employees waited in line this morning, some for as long as an hour, to get into the building and find out if they still had a job. Between layoffs and buyouts, HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. says he plans to fire about 20,000 workers. Matthew Herper is following all of this for Stat News and joins us now. So, Matt, fill in the picture about the scope of what's happening here, the range of staffers who are being cut.
Oh, it's very, very broad. In the CDC, we're talking tobacco control, injury prevention, workplace safety, birth defects, reproductive health, basically everything that is not infectious disease. And at the FDA, the cuts are, I think, a lot deeper than a lot of people expected. People who review new medical products, the people who actually look at a new drug or device, mostly seem to have been safe, but a lot of expertise. Late last week, before the layoffs, the top vaccine official, also in charge of gene therapy and the blood supply, was removed. Today, a director at the Office of New Drugs and the head of the Tobacco Center were removed. Several former FDA commissioners expressed concern, including Scott Gottlieb, who was FDA commissioner under the Trump administration, worrying about a return to delays in drug approvals, and Robert Califf saying that the FDA, as we know it, is finished with most of the leaders with institutional knowledge and deep understanding of product development and safety no longer employed.
Well, the HHS secretary said in a statement that the firings were intended to reduce what he called bureaucratic sprawl. HHS is among the largest federal agencies in terms of spending, given the kind of work that it does. Prior to this, had bloat or bureaucratic inefficiencies been an issue that people were focused on?
Oh, well, it's certainly a problem, and something that anyone who's worked in the agency will tell you, that there is a lot of bloat and efficiency, and that it can be maddening with all the different fiefdoms in such a large and sometimes bureaucratic agency. But I mean, some of those same people, I mean, another former FDA commissioner, Margaret Hamburg, said it was horrifying, thoughtless, and very short-sighted, but also pointed out that she had seen similar problems in terms of bloat. I think a big question here is going to be whether these changes actually do increase efficiency, or whether there were some back office or procedural functions that were important to the smooth running of the agency that may be hard to replace.
To what extent do these cuts reflect RFK Jr.'s desire to change the government's approach to public health?
Well, I think they certainly reflect that. I mean, the CDC is being refocused very much on infectious disease. A lot of, already before this, through the cuts from the Department of Government Efficiency, a lot of those cuts we did see cuts focused on things, including vaccines. So I think we are starting to see a picture emerging, particularly at the FDA, which people had kind of thought might be insulated from Secretary Kennedy's ideas, that a lot of those are in play. And also a lot of the ideas that this whole agency is not efficient, that it's really beholden to industry, and changes in focus. I think what Secretary Kennedy means when he talks about food safety, where he's talking about additives, and whereas the FDA has often been focused on things like whether you're going to catch diseases from your food, right?
Matthew Harper, senior writer with Stat News. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Meantime, President Trump is set to reveal a new set of tariffs tomorrow, which has the American public and U.S. trading partners anxiously waiting to see which countries and which industries will be taxed the hardest. President Trump is set to begin the biggest gamble of his second term so far, a sweeping round of reciprocal tariffs on imports, a move he's branding as Liberation Day.
I always say tariffs is the most beautiful word to me in the dictionary.
Tariffs have long been central to the president's economic vision. Now, by taxing imports from some of the country's biggest trading partners, he's hoping Americans will favor American-made goods to revitalize U.S. manufacturing.
The automakers are going to make a lot of money, the American automakers.
Despite economists' warnings about the president's tariff plan triggering higher prices, a possible recession, and a global trade war, the White House press secretary today reiterated Mr. Trump's confidence.
They're not going to be wrong. It is going to work. And the president has a brilliant team of advisors who have been studying these issues for decades. And we are focused on restoring the golden age of America.
A similar message from House Republicans.
You have to trust the president's instincts on the economy. It may be rocky in the beginning, but I think that this will make sense for Americans and it will help all Americans.
But across the aisle, Democrats in both chambers are unconvinced, accusing the Trump administration of playing fast and loose with Americans' finances.
Hardworking Americans just want a little breathing room and some stability in their busy lives. But what they've received from Donald Trump is chaos, confusion, and corruption.
Democratic Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia even introduced a resolution to end the emergency tariffs on Canada that the president signed earlier this year, arguing tariffs on Canada have a damaging ripple effect through the U.S. economy.
We need to stand strong against a tax increase, the largest tax increase in American history, on our consumers. We need to stand strong for a strong relationship with a good ally, Canada, and that's why I'm really, really excited we have this vote coming up.
Kaine's effort has picked up support from some GOP lawmakers, like Maine Senator Susan Collins, who worries her constituents will bear the burden of higher prices. Meantime, America's allies are preparing for the worst. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen today said the EU is ready to act.
We do not necessarily want to retaliate, but if it is necessary, we have a strong plan to retaliate and we will use it.
In the day's other headlines, Attorney General Pam Bondi has directed federal prosecutors to pursue the death penalty for Luigi Mangione, the accused shooter of United Healthcare CEO. That is in line with President Trump's Day 1 executive order compelling DOJ to seek capital punishment whenever possible. Mangione faces both state and federal murder charges. His state trial is expected to go first and would carry a maximum punishment of life in prison. President Trump's first term saw more federal executions than under any president in modern history. His predecessor, Joe Biden, prohibited federal executions. In Lithuania, the fourth and final U.S. Army soldier who went missing in Lithuania last week, along with 3 others, has been found dead. Their armored vehicle submerged in a swamp during a training exercise near the Belarus border, spurring a difficult week-long recovery operation. The U.S. Army is notifying next of kin and investigating what caused the incident jointly with Lithuanian authorities. In the Middle East, Israel struck the Lebanese capital of Beirut today for the second time since a ceasefire with Hezbollah took effect last November. It hit a building in the city's southern suburbs, killing 4 people. Israel says its target was a Hezbollah member who was helping to plan an attack against Israeli civilians. Residents of the area say the strike came without warning.
We were sleeping. We hear a sound, and a powerful strike hit. My daughters asked me what was going on. I told them, don't be afraid. You can't tell a child these are strikes. They've lived through them. We asked around what had happened. They said the strike hit our neighbor next to us.
Meantime, in Gaza, as Israel cut off all imports to Gaza in recent weeks, today a UN food agency says that has led to the closure of all of its bakeries in the territory. The World Food Program says hundreds of thousands of Palestinians relied on their bread and warned of dire food insecurity. Severe storms brought torrential rain and gale-force winds to several Greek islands. Roads resembled rivers in Mykonos and Crete, while floods swept cars into the sea on the island of Paros. Schools were closed and all traffic has been banned except for emergency vehicles. Meantime, in Iceland, a volcano began erupting in the country's southwest this morning. It happened just hours after the remaining residents in the nearby village of Grindavik were successfully evacuated. The volcano became active again in 2023 after lying dormant for 800 years. Back here at home on Capitol Hill, House Speaker Mike Johnson tried to use a rare parliamentary maneuver to squash a proposal for proxy voting by 2 new mothers in Congress. The move failed. 9 Republicans joined all House Democrats to sink Johnson's effort. The bipartisan proxy voting plan by Florida Republican Anna Paulina Luna and Colorado Democrat Brittany Peterson means new parents in Congress wouldn't need to vote in person. Peterson, with her newborn in her arms, spoke on the House floor today.
It is unfathomable that in 2025 we have not modernized Congress to address these very unique challenges that members face, these life events.
Speaker Johnson is very much against proxy voting, calling it unconstitutional. President Trump has pushed for more people to return to in-person work in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. To the other chamber now, Senator Cory Booker has been speaking on the Senate floor in a marathon speech that's lasted all night and continues to this hour. The New Jersey Democrat said he's responding to the, quote, grave and urgent threat the Trump administration poses.
In just 71 days, the President of the United States has inflicted so much harm on Americans' safety, financial stability, the core foundations of our democracy. These are not normal times in America.
It's not a filibuster, it's a floor speech. And Booker approaches the record of 24 hours for that kind of speech, held for nearly 70 years by Strom Thurmond, who was arguing against the Civil Rights Act. Booker has yielded questions from fellow Democrats, but he's stayed standing the entire time to comply with Senate rules. On Wall Street today, stocks finished mixed ahead of President Trump's anticipated tariff action tomorrow. The Dow Jones Industrial Average barely budged, while the Nasdaq posted a gain of more than 150 points, or nearly 1%. The S&P 500 also notched a slight increase on the day. And while we're on the topic of money, the United States has added a few household names to Forbes magazine's annual billionaire list. Music legend Bruce Springsteen made the cut at $1.2 billion. Movie star Arnold Schwarzenegger and comedian Jerry Seinfeld each tallied $1.1 billion. 103 Americans became new billionaires this year, and that is the most of any country on the list. It should be noted, too, that just 15% of this year's class are women. Still to come on the NewsHour, the nominee to lead the Joint Chiefs of Staff goes before Congress. The impact of private equity's expansion into healthcare. The Trump administration slashes an agency that supports libraries and museums, plus much more.
This is the PBS NewsHour from the David M. Rubenstein Studio at WETA in Washington, and in the West from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University.
Recovery efforts from the earthquake last week in Myanmar are slow-moving. The country is grappling with a natural disaster plus an ongoing humanitarian crisis amid a civil war that started 4 years ago.
The death toll has now risen past 2,700, with more than 4,500 people injured and at least 440 still missing. Stephanie Tsai has this report.
As sirens wailed, rescue workers in Mandalay stood still. A 1-minute pause to honor the thousands of victims of Friday's earthquake. And then back to work. Teams are still sifting through the rubble for survivors. Officials said a 63-year-old woman was found alive today in a collapsed building in Naypyidaw. She'd been trapped for almost 4 days. But hopes for finding more survivors dim with each hour, said the head of Myanmar's military.
Among the missing, most are assumed to be dead. There is a narrow chance for them to remain alive, as it has been over 72 hours.
The army took control of the country in a 2021 coup, sparking a civil war and humanitarian crisis.
Before the earthquake, people had been dealing with 4 years of conflict in Myanmar.
Melissa Hine works for the World Food Program in the Southeast Asian nation.
So there was some 20 million people already needing humanitarian assistance and 3.5 million people displaced. And that was before Friday.
The epicenter of the 7.7 magnitude earthquake was near Mandalay, Myanmar's second largest city. The impact area is widespread, including rural areas with scarce communication infrastructure. The cities are overwhelmed. Patients wait to be seen in overcrowded hospitals, and makeshift wards have been set up outside. International organizations are surging resources into the country, but the supply of basic necessities like food and water is scarce, handed out in single portions. Recent cuts to American aid may leave a gap, says Hine.
I think about 40% of humanitarian assistance for Myanmar was thanks to the U.S. government.
Under the Trump administration, which has gutted USAID, the umbrella organization for American aid abroad, the U.S. response to the disaster has been limited. Yesterday, the State Department said it was sending a handful of humanitarian workers and $2 million.
We expect that this earthquake response will cost around $20 million at least.
Other countries have stepped in to fill the vacuum. Russia sent rescue teams and established a mobile hospital.
Today we launched operations. We have the first patients already.
And China, which shares a border with Myanmar, was the first to send rescue teams, trumpeting its efforts on state TV. This interview was first broadcast by China News Service.
I wish all the rescue team members a safe and healthy life, and I appreciate you all.
At least 10,000 buildings have collapsed. Residents are encamped along the streets in fear of aftershocks that continue to convulse their already fragile nation. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Stephanie Tsai.
President Trump's pick to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the president's most senior military advisor, told senators during his confirmation hearing today that he would give the president candid guidance and stay out of politics.
But he also said he was willing to push back if ever asked to do something unconstitutional. And he signaled concern about recent messages sent by senior national security leaders over an unclassified messaging app. Here's Nick Schifrin.
Committee will come to order.
Today, in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee, President Trump's chairman of the Joint Chiefs nominee promised to keep himself and the military apolitical.
Are you willing to get fired from this job for doing the right thing and following the Constitution?
I am. But immediately, retired Lieutenant General Dan Kane, nicknamed Raisin, was dragged into a partisan fight. Democratic senators raised messages sent by Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth on the unclassified app Signal that 2 weeks ago revealed the exact timing and weapon systems before U.S. strikes on Yemen.
We should always preserve the element of surprise.
Is discussing the kinds of matters that were discussed on Signal preserving the element of surprise?
Given the fact that the chairman and ranking member have been asked for an investigation, I don't want to comment on the particulars.
I would say that if you're truly speaking truth to power, that the answer would obviously be no, it does not preserve the element of surprise.
If you see classified information or war plans information or tactical information on an unclassified chain, what would you do to stop the conversation?
Well, I think I would weigh in and stop it if I was a part of it, but in this case I wasn't.
Kane, like his father, was a decorated fighter pilot whose last position was the senior military liaison to the CIA. He spent much of his career in special operations forces, including in the counter-ISIS campaign in Iraq, where in 2018 he briefed President Trump as the president recounted last year.
So I walked down, and this is where I met General Raisin Kane. And what's your name? General, what's your name? And he gave me his name. What's your name, Sergeant? Yes, sir, and I love you, sir. I think you're great, sir. I'll kill for you, sir. Then he puts on a Make America Great Again hat. You're not allowed to do that, but they did it.
General Kane, did you wear a MAGA hat in front of the president?
No, sir.
Did you wear a MAGA hat at any time?
No, sir. I think I went back and listened to those tapes, and I think the president was actually talking about somebody else, and I've never worn any political merchandise or said anything to that effect.
If you did wear a MAGA hat, would that constitute partisan political activity by a uniformed officer?
I think it probably would, yes, Senator.
Kane's two predecessors have both run afoul of President Trump. Air Force General C.Q. Brown, chosen by President Biden, was fired. And General Mark Milley, chosen by President Trump, but later deeply critical of him, now faces post-retirement investigations, and his portraits at the Pentagon have been removed.
General Brown's dismissal reveals, once again, President Trump's intention to install yes men and women with fealty to him and not to the Constitution or the American people.
But Republican senators praised Kane's experience, which does not include commands of a military service or regional headquarters. That will require Kane to receive presidential exemptions.
Well, I agree that the dismissal of your predecessor was unfortunate. It's behind us. And I cannot think of a better person to replace General Brown than you.
We are in very challenging times. We all recognize this. We need a change. You are that change.
And even some Democrats said at the end of the day, they wanted Kane to give the president his best military advice.
Will you push to be in that room?
Yes, ma'am.
Good. We want you there.
For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Nick Schifrin.
It's a small federal agency few have heard of, but with a large impact across the country. That's the Institute of Museum and Library Services, or IMLS.
And yesterday, the Trump administration placed roughly 80% of its staff on administrative leave. Senior arts correspondent Jeffrey Brown has this report for our Arts and Culture series, Canvas.
Libraries are for checking out books, of course, but these days they serve a variety of other functions as well, providing residents with access to computers and the internet. refuge during extreme weather, a place to vote, and a variety of classes, including language and fitness. For their part, major museums with blockbuster exhibitions may get the most attention, but around the country, museums come in all sizes and themes, many focused on aspects of local life. The main source of federal funding for libraries and museums, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, or IMLS, established in 1996. Its 2024 budget of over $290 million was larger than two other better-known culturally focused agencies, the National Endowment for the Arts and National Endowment for the Humanities. But a recent executive order by President Trump named the IMLS as one of 7 small federal agencies to be, quote, eliminated to the maximum extent consistent with applicable law. In a statement provided to the NewsHour, an administration official said yesterday's action is part of a mandate to reduce bureaucracy and is a necessary step to fulfill that order and ensure hard-earned tax dollars are not diverted to discriminatory DEI initiatives or divisive anti-American programming in our cultural institutions. And for a response to all this, I'm joined by Cindy Hole. She's a Kansas City librarian and current president of the American Library Association. So thanks for joining us. So this is an agency few of us know about, but important to you and your members. How important? What kind of role does it play?
Absolutely. The Institute for Museum and Library Services is a federal agency that was created by Congress to improve and support the nation's public libraries and museums. And so this funding has been critical to especially small and rural libraries all across the country. We have seen IMLS monies going towards research and policymaking and grants, and this funding has been critical to Americans.
In the statement we received from the administration about yesterday's action, it referred to DEI or anti-American programming. Do you know what that might be referring to? What's your response to that?
Well, libraries are here to connect all people to information and ideas. We believe that all Americans should have equal rights to access accurate information from credible sources. And so it's so important that Americans continue to be able to have access to programs that enrich their lives, educational programs. And of course, if we're talking about libraries, it's going to be literacy based. And so the focus of programming in any public sector is to always be able to provide information to people that is credible and trusted.
I understand it's different with different libraries in different states, but is it possible to say how much of the funding would be impacted by the loss of this agency?
It's so important that everyone has access to IMLS funding. So the current IMLS funding is funneled down through the state library agencies. And these state library agencies provide funding allocated across their state for libraries to be able to offer programs such as summer learning and reading. And that's something that has been so important to Americans.
You know, one argument you could imagine against the IMLS right now, there has to be budget cuts. This agency's only been around since 1996. Why not go to a time before that? What's the need for the agency now? What would be your response to that?
We have never needed information accessible and accurate in a more greater time period. When you look at libraries providing essential services to the public, they should be open and everyone should have unfettered access to those library spaces and museums as well. When we look at the history of this country, it's important that Americans are able to read about the history of the people who helped founded this nation and those who continue to work in these public spaces in present day. When we look to the strength of libraries, it's always important that we look at all of the different ways that libraries provide services to people. There are many people who cannot afford internet access in their homes, and they rely upon their local public library to be able to access internet services so that they can apply for jobs and benefits, so that they can even have access to telehealth appointments with their healthcare provider. You know, when you look at all of the things that libraries offer, we always need more service and we need to invest in our communities so that everyone has access to information.
And very briefly, how much are you able to push back with, along with the museums, to fight this? Do you anticipate that this agency will soon be gone?
We encourage every American to reach out to their representatives and to let them know how important libraries are in their community. With 125,000 libraries in this country, we have many opportunities here to help our representatives know that Americans love their libraries and that we expect to have access to information.
All right, Cindy Hole is the president of the American Library Association. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Steward Healthcare was, at one point, the largest private hospital system in the country. When the private equity-backed network filed for bankruptcy last year, it devastated providers and patients.
In Massachusetts, 5 of the 8 Steward-owned hospitals were salvaged by the state, but 2 were shuttered. Economics correspondent Paul Salmon went to see what and how it happened.
At first, hope.
We thought when they came in, great, we're going to have a bigger company, they're going to put money into it.
Money from a rich and supposedly savvy private equity firm, Cerberus. And the new hospital network, Steward Healthcare, would be run by a noted heart surgeon, Ralph de la Torre. For struggling hospitals, an injection of cash, plus medically minded leadership. A good match, right?
It was just run so poorly and so mismanaged.
Elaine Graves was a nurse at Kearny Hospital in Boston's relatively poor Dorchester for nearly 50 years, before it's being shuttered last summer. Because, says Graves, after Cerberus bought the hospital in 2010,
things were being broken, elevators, they weren't working, we're down to one elevator.
Audra Sprague was a nurse at another Cerberus Steward hospital.
Over the years, it was one cut after the other and staffing cut. We were on credit hold because we weren't paying our bills.
The MO of private equity leveraged buyouts, the buyer, in this case Cerberus Steward, goes to a lender for a many $million-dollar loan. Gets the money, that's the leverage, which just means debt, which it then uses to buy properties like a hospital. The property then has to pay off the debt. One way to do that, cut costs, ignore bills.
People would come in for surgery. They couldn't get the equipment, so they had to send them home. Sorry. It happened all the time. They owed so much money to creditors for equipment, but they wouldn't give it to them anymore.
We heard it time and again, unpaid bills, cuts in resources. And yet a Boston Globe investigation found that CEO de la Torre traveled by private jet and managed to buy a $40 million yacht. Steward's bankruptcy made national headlines. Private equity Cerberus, which sold Steward for an $800 million profit, was blamed. Cerberus wouldn't go on the record to us, but provided additional background last fall, claiming complaints and lawsuits, quote, appear to be overwhelmingly related to the post-Cerberus ownership period and portray a stark contrast to Cerberus's ownership period, during which Steward was delivering high-quality care to millions of patients and employing thousands of hardworking professionals. But nurse Elaine Graves, who does seem like a hardworking professional, began to notice cuts soon after the buyout, years before the private jet. And then
they just kept chopping and until there was nothing left.
Does she blame private equity ownership?
Yeah, because they're the one that took everything away from these patients and from the community.
So, where do patients go since the hospital closure in Dorchester?
They're going into the Boston hospitals and overwhelming those hospital emergency rooms. Ambulances are waiting out in the parking lot for an hour, hour and a half, just to get into the hospital.
No surprise, as 40 miles northwest of Boston and Ayer, same story. Neshoba Valley Medical Center, also part of the takeover, also shut its doors.
We've had a hospital in Ayer for over 120 years, in the current site for 60 years.
Town manager Robert Pombrian.
We lost the health care not only for Ayer, but for the Neshoba Valley region. 600 jobs are gone, and we're still feeling the pain. The impact to the emergency management system is put it into a crisis threshold.
That would be the town fire department.
Most of our calls are EMS. The vast majority of time we spend in a day is prepping for EMS.
How long for an emergency when Neshoba was open, called to delivery at the hospital?
We could do that all in about 30 to 40 minutes.
Now,
Anywhere from an hour to 2, depending on where we're going.
and when the ambulance does get to nearby hospitals, they're now swamped.
It's been chaos here.
Neshoba nurse Audra Sprague.
There's another hospital that's a community hospital as well, about 15 miles from where Neshoba was, but it's already overwhelmed, and they've seen a 20% increase in their emergency room visits since we closed.
And it's not just a loss of the ER.
Ended up getting pulled up into the air.
Professional tree trimmer Chris Martin.
And then when I let go, the limb came down, crushed my ankle and broke my leg, and then fell sideways, breaking 2 ribs on this side, all my ribs on this side, punctured the lung, gave me a brain bleed, destroyed my ear, fixed my ankle with pins, and then trying to get into rehab because Neshoba closed, and it's taken me 9 weeks just to get into a slot because they're all so inundated with all the people coming from Neshoba.
And while he had to wait, he got worse.
I'm getting more and more headaches, and that's why I ended up going to the emergency room last week, because my headaches, they usually only lasted about an hour, and they've been lasting longer and longer and longer. We had to drive all the way out to Worcester because the hospital's closed. So we got there in the afternoon, 2:33, and then we didn't get home till 1:30 in the morning.
And that's just for neurology, says his wife Allie, who was a receptionist at Neshoba.
If you have one injury, you get discharged, you have one doctor you're following up with. Well, he's got 7 different doctors he's following up with.
Scattered all across the region.
All of his follow-up, we probably could have done at Neshoba. So the chaos of trying to do everything at a hospital where our primary care isn't affiliated is one difficulty. And spending 9 hours at an ER just to get a CAT scan to make sure his head bleed didn't start again, or there was something acute that was happening. It just shouldn't take that long.
Meanwhile, a sudden call to deliver another man who fell from a tree to a medevac helicopter to get him to the nearest hospital quickly. But the copter was grounded. A 7-minute ride became a 45-minute ordeal. So is what happened in Ayer and Dorchester a one-off? One company with an unscrupulous CEO? Or is it not that unusual when private equity gets into healthcare? Stay tuned for our next report. For the PBS NewsHour, Paul Solman in Dorchester and Ayer, Massachusetts.
The Trump administration said yesterday it's reviewing about $9 billion in federal grants to Harvard, citing the school's response to anti-Semitism. And today, Princeton said several dozen of its federal grants had been halted. They are just the latest moves targeting colleges. Last week, Columbia agreed to policy changes after the administration pulled $400 million in federal funding. Partly in response, Yale University philosophy professor Jason Stanley announced he's leaving not only his school, but the country to teach at the University of Toronto in Canada. Stanley said he's making the move so he can, quote, raise his kids in a country that's not tilting towards a fascist dictatorship. For more on his decision, Jason Stanley joins me now. Professor Stanley, welcome to the NewsHour. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me on.
So you have authored 2 books on fascism. It's a topic you spend a lot of time studying. Your decision to leave has been framed as you fleeing the U.S. That's the word people are using. Is that how you see it?
No, though, but that has resonance with Jewish intellectuals fleeing Nazi Germany in the 1930s. So it's kind of interesting to see the use of that word. I made my decision for both political reasons and personal reasons. It's clear to me that it's time to go for an academic and a critic of the Trump administration who has the privilege to have an opportunity to leave.
We've seen universities come under attack of this administration. Is this just your decision? Is it just about what you've seen happening at universities and colleges?
Well, that was what sealed it. I had an offer from the University of Toronto and had gone back and forth about the offer. I had thought I'd assigned like 50% probability to taking it. But when Columbia folded, that's when I thought, okay, I'm just going to look at the probabilities of our institutions folding, of our democratic institutions folding. And by that, I mean not just the universities, but the media and our legal system. And I thought, well, maybe they can hold the line, but this is an opportunity. It's a great opportunity. And I think the probabilities are not in the favor of U.S. democracy.
If Columbia had responded differently, what do you think would be different now? In other words, what would you have wanted Columbia to do?
I would have wanted all of our universities to collectively band together and loudly call BS on the charge that somehow intellectuals and universities, by allowing free speech and protest, are threatening Jewish students.
And why do you think they didn't do that and universities aren't doing that now?
I mean, I think one reason is that they don't see the situation for what it is. They don't see the anti-Semitism charge as just an excuse. And I would like universities to see that this is a war, that the Trump administration is going to try to take them down, come what may. It just doesn't matter what excuse they use. So to watch these universities sit there and go, oh, this is such a, $9 billion for anti-Semitism, when there were many, many Jewish students in the anti-war protests who are somehow being erased both by the media, the Trump administration, and the universities. So they're kind of acting like hostages who are sort of repeating the lines that they're told. So I would like to see them band together collectively and recognize what they're facing, which is a war.
Universities also argue that the threat of these funding cuts are really existential in some cases. They wouldn't be allowed to continue to do the work if those cuts came through. Isn't there something to that? They have an obligation to survive.
No, there's no survival. A university is a democratic institution. And if you give up the democratic nature of a university, then there's no university there. There's a name and some buildings. And that's what we risk. Sure, you could leave some names and a building, but that's not the survival of a university.
At the same time, Professor Stanley, this is the country you were born in, right? It's the country you call home. It's a university you've worked at for more than a decade. If you believe in this democratic system and this country, why not stay? Why not do all you can to defend it?
Well, believe me, I'll be doing a lot to defend it in Toronto, where we're going to be organizing to defend democracies. But this administration wants me to love my country like the National Socialists wanted Germans to love Germany, because it's a powerful nation that can punch other nations in the nose. That's not why I love my country. I love my country because we don't have kings. And if my country decides to adopt a king, then it's no longer really my country. Like if universities decide that they're no longer going to allow protest, free speech, critical inquiry into history, they're no longer universities.
You also have 2 young children. So I wonder what you're telling them about why you're moving to a different country.
Well, my kids are Black and Jewish, so there's a lot of issues we're facing. But I'm telling them, you're American. We love our country. You have lots of family here, but these are risky conditions. My parents are Holocaust survivors. This is something that my family has discussed. My kids are not politically ignorant. They can recognize what's going on.
Do you expect that you'll come back?
It's very hard to move as an academic, but this is my home. I hope our universities fight back, but I'm going to do whatever I can to help American democracy wherever I am.
It's Professor Jason Stanley, currently with Yale University, soon to be of the University of Toronto, joining us tonight. Professor Stanley, thank you. Good to speak with you.
Thank you.
As we discuss new tariffs here in the U.S., a look now at how tariffs can make or break an economy. In this case, Haiti, where U.S. trade policies force the government to bring down tariffs on foreign goods, which allowed American farmers to export their crops cheaply. But that made it too expensive for Haitians to eat the food grown domestically. Special correspondent Marcia Biggs and videographer Eric O'Connor have a look now at how this helped lead to decades of dependence on foreign aid.
It seems like a world away from the typical scenes of violence that have ravaged Haiti's capital. The northeast region of the country is home to some of Haiti's safest and most fertile lands. But rice farmers here are fighting their own battle, struggling to compete with cheap imports.
Miami Rice has lowered our prices, which means we don't have any advantage.
Miami Rice is what the Haitians call imported American rice that has flooded their market since the 1980s, selling at a fraction of the price of rice grown in-country. It all began in 1986 when the International Monetary Fund agreed to provide Haiti with huge loans in exchange for slashing tariffs on imported goods. At the same time, the U.S. government began subsidizing American rice farmers, allowing them to export very cheap rice overseas. Albert Pierre Joseph is the son of a rice farmer.
I grew up in a family that lived off the land. My father had 15 children, and it is with this land that he educated all 15 of us. Since I was a child, my father produced a lot of rice, and many traders used to come and buy rice from him. The customs tariff that was reduced on rice throughout my childhood affected me a lot. It meant that the amount of money my father used to make to meet our needs, well, he couldn't bring that in anymore.
Like Albert's father, many farmers were unable to keep up and abandoned the land.
Today we come together as friends.
Under President Bill Clinton, another deal was made to lower tariffs on imports to Haiti from 35% to just 3%, as part of a plan to help the country industrialize. 15 years later, Clinton famously apologized.
Since 1981, the United States has followed a policy that we rich countries that produce a lot of food should sell it to poor countries and relieve them of the burden of producing their own food. So thank goodness they can leap directly into the industrial era. It has not worked. It's maybe been good for some of my farmers in Arkansas, but it has not worked. It was a mistake. I did that. I have to live every day with the consequences of the lost capacity to produce a rice crop in Haiti to feed those people because of what I did, nobody else.
Efforts to change the tariff policy failed, and cheap American rice continues to flow into the country to this day. It's even changed the dietary habits of Haitians who used to eat rice 2 to 3 times a week, but now consume it every day. International aid groups try to support local farmers. USAID helped Albert Pierre to build this mill for a collective of almost 1,000 farmers that wouldn't otherwise have the resources to mill and sell their crop. And the collective sells much of its rice to the World Food Program, also a recipient of USAID funds. It's part of the World Food Program's overall strategy to source as much of its food locally as possible, and it relies significantly on cash-based assistance and development projects. But it also receives what is called in-kind assistance, bags of food grown in the U.S. and shipped overseas. Thomas DeVille is the head of WFP's school feeding program in Haiti, which receives much of its funding from USAID.
We would prefer to rely 100% of local production, for sure, but Haiti is not self-sufficient yet. It takes time to get to 100% local procurement. It takes programs such as our resilience, capacity building programs. It takes training with the local farmers, and it takes intervention to improve irrigation systems, and it takes a lot of work with the Ministry of Agriculture to make sure that we have ambitious policies to promote local production.
Would it be more helpful to receive aid in that arena rather than rice grown abroad?
We need both. We can't ignore the more than 5 million Haitian people, so half of the country, that is facing high levels of food insecurity. This is staggering levels.
But even if they didn't need it, they are also required to bring in some food from the U.S. The United States provides international food aid through 2 main programs. The first, the Emergency Food Security Program, allows more flexibility. Implementers like the WFP can buy local food or provide direct cash assistance to those in need. But the other, Food for Peace, requires that 100% of aid be commodities produced in the United States. a caveat originally meant to help American farmers.
There were some years in the 1950s and 60s where food aid was the main outlet for which U.S. commodities were shipped for things like wheat, for example.
Stephanie Mercier is a former chief economist for the Democratic staff of the Senate Agriculture Committee, in charge of food aid legislation.
But today, U.S. food aid accounts for a little bit less than 2% of all total U.S. exports. So it's a much smaller share of what's going on than it was at the beginning.
So who's the biggest winner in the food aid industry?
The biggest winner are the companies that own U.S. flagships that carry U.S. commodities for food aid programs overseas.
Mercier and her colleagues at the American Enterprise Institute, a Washington think tank, studied the effect of a 1950s law that requires half of all food aid be shipped on American-flagged vessels, which she says typically charge at least 60% more than foreign carriers.
But our estimate overall was that that's at least $50 million a year that goes to these shipping companies that otherwise could be used for buying food to feed hungry people. And that means that we feed 1 to 2 million fewer hungry people around the world every year.
So where do you think that money's going?
Into the company coffers of those U.S. shipping companies that we talked about.
If you look again at Haiti, last year USAID spent over $35 million on food aid. Of that, Mercier says $10.6 million was spent on shipping food to a country that has the ability to produce its own food.
Would you like to see the imports stop?
If we block imports and this rice can't enter the country, Haitians will not be able to get enough to eat. And don't forget, we have an extremely poor population. 78% of Haitians are living on less than $1 per day, which was why many of them buy imported rice, even though they know imported rice is not the best rice for them to eat.
Just after his inauguration, President Trump paused all foreign aid for 90 days. Elon Musk's so-called Department of Government Oversight shut down USAID shortly thereafter, writing on the X platform that he spent the weekend feeding it into the wood chipper. In-kind food shipments to organizations like the WFP are supposed to be protected by the Emergency Food Assistance Waiver. But the abrupt dismantling of USAID has created chaos, putting at risk shipments of food not already in the pipeline. Development projects like Albert Pierre's aren't covered by the waiver. He says he was supposed to receive a transfer in funds from USAID by the end of January, but the money never came, and the project was canceled. He hasn't had to shut his mill just yet, but he's slowed down operations, and he's looking to other organizations for help. He still believes that the way to make Haiti food independent is a delicate balance between increasing tariffs slowly so that American rice isn't dirt cheap, while also investing in infrastructure and providing loans to local farmers.
I believe we can solve this, but in order to solve it, we need to have a visionary state. We need to have a private sector that is committed, a private sector that is productive and believes in national development.
But with 85% of the capital controlled by gangs, the state is more concerned with daily survival than a vision for the future. To fill that void, a grassroots effort to increase production came from local farmers. They needed irrigation, so they dug a canal.
They got together. They took their destiny in hand. They came with shovels, pickaxes, with whatever they had, and they dug it by hand. This was entirely the work of the Haitian population, a work that brought hope, that still brings hope for the Haitian people.
The hope in the dignity, against all odds, of providing for themselves.
I've picked up that there's a real sense of pride among Haitians for their rice. Is that true?
Oh yes. We have a sense of pride for the local rice. Even if you hear people eating imported rice, they buy imported rice to eat during the week, but they buy the local rice to eat with the family on Sundays. I think it's that sense of pride that should motivate us to invest a lot more in the rice industry, so we can produce more rice for the country and also to sell abroad.
But in a state mostly overrun with violence, corruption, and poverty, it's a vision reaching far into the future. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Marcia Biggs in Fort Liberté, Northeast Haiti.
Remember, there's always a lot more online, including where you can sign up for our Here's the Deal weekly politics newsletter that takes a look at 3 things to watch for this week. Subscribe at pbs.org/newshour.
And that is the NewsHour for tonight. I'm Jeff Bennett.
And I'm Amna Nawaz. On behalf of the entire NewsHour team, thank you for joining us.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by
moving our economy for 160 years. BNSF, the engine that connects us.
Carnegie Corporation of New York, working to reduce political polarization through philanthropic support for education, democracy, and peace. More information at carnegie.org. And with the ongoing support of these institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. You're watching PBS.